I noted the irony of the first line of our first hymn, "The strife is o'er, the battle is done." It seems like this past week we're simply locked in strife and going off to continuous battles, whether it's war in Europe or strife at home. And what is all of this about? What are these struggles about, and what are they for? Well, regardless of where you fall on some of these issues, I think we can all agree that we're locked in, we're witnessing, we're engaging in struggles for power. There are struggles for power raging throughout the world today, in our homes, in our hearts, in our churches, in our neighborhoods, in our towns. And so when we read today's lessons, when we read these lessons today, we have to stop and think, because what we encounter in these lessons today is another kind of power. We see God's power on display in these readings today. And we see how God uses this power to bring people to faith. We see that God uses his power to include people and to create a sense of belonging. In the reading today from Acts, Peter raises Tabitha, who belongs to what was at the time the order of widows. It's not just that she was a widow. The widows of the church were gathered into a group. They were kind of the precursors to maybe what we had called nuns or sisters, deaconesses. They did works of charity, and they committed themselves to helping and hospitality and to that ministry within the church. And so when Tabitha dies, it's her sister widows who gather around her and display all of the wonderful works she did. Tabitha is raised by a mighty act of power through Peter. God is at work to raise her from the dead. The book of Revelation today paints a picture of what belonging to the community of the redeemed looks like. When Jesus restores those of his followers who have suffered and died for his sake, they sing to him his praises. They sing to God praises through the mighty power of Jesus' restoration. And in John, Jesus speaks of all of these works. He says the works, meaning the miracles, the healings, the raisings from the dead, the exorcism, all of these works that you have seen me do, I do them in my Father's name, and they bear witness of me. These are acts of power that God puts on display to call you into this community, into this belonging. The religious leaders, though, approach Jesus and they ask for proof, as if they need more proof. And what Jesus gives them is this record. He gives them the record of many people who can attest to who he is because of the powerful things Jesus has done for them. And what they do is they go out and they tell stories about Jesus. And those stories, then the telling of those stories, create a sense of community and a sense of belonging. Oh, he healed you too? Well, he made me walk. He cast out my demons. He raised my daughter from the dead. He told me I was loved. And so that's how the church got started, by telling stories like these, because people had a shared experience of God's power through Jesus. And they discovered that therefore they belonged to each other in a new way. And what we need to do is we need to find those stories in our own lives and in the lives of our fellow Christians. We need to find those stories about God acting in our lives and tell those stories about God acting in our lives. And the process of that, the process of discovering those stories, is how the church finds herself. And it's how the church represents and puts the power of God on display by sharing that story of God acting in our lives. And incidentally, that's also how the church grows and how it evangelizes, by sharing our collective story with the outside world. I think we get into trouble, though, and the church falters in her mission when we give in to this nagging sense in our hearts, this demand for evidence, instead of listening to the story, and instead of seeing ourselves as part of the story. This happens in the exchange with the religious leaders today and Jesus in the temple. Jesus is walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon, and the Jews gather around him and say to him, "How long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." And Jesus says, "I have told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name testify to me. Now, the Jews here in John's gospel mean the religious leaders specifically, and they want proof. They're Jesus' adversaries. They want proof that Jesus is the Messiah. Now, maybe that sounds reasonable to you. Maybe you're the kind of person, too, who wants proof. Wouldn't it be nice, you say, sort of like Thomas a few weeks ago? Wouldn't it be nice to have real proof that God is real? Wouldn't it be nice to have real proof that Jesus really performed these miracles instead of these stories that we have about them? Wouldn't it be nice to have real proof that he rose from the dead? And of course, I think behind that objection, that question is, you mean scientific proof, right? You mean the kind that can be reproduced in a laboratory. And Jesus replies to his accusers, and his reply is meant for all of us. He says, more or less, do you hear the stories that people are telling about me? Do you hear the stories of the works that I have done in my Father's name? Have you listened plainly to what I am teaching and what I am speaking? What more evidence could you possibly need? Well, let's be honest. The evidence that his accusers are looking for is the kind of evidence that will hold up in a court of law. It's the kind of evidence that they can use to convict Jesus and kill him for blasphemy and for identifying himself with God. I and the Father are one. What a statement. What a way to basically give them the evidence that they're looking for. You see, for these kinds of people, nothing about Jesus, nothing anyone says, no story in the world will ever make them believe. They do not believe, and here comes the hard part. Jesus says, because they do not belong. Jesus says, you do not belong because you do not belong to my sheep. That's one of those hard sayings in the gospel, and we're very lucky that the gospel doesn't stop there, because Jesus opens up to us a pathway for all of us to become his sheep. All of us can become part of Jesus' flock by becoming part of his story. So we hear his story and we join his story. We can become part of that story that goes through the cross, the story that is in the shape of a cross, which means it has some pain and suffering in it. When Tabitha died, no one thought that she would be raised from the dead. They went to get Peter, it's true, but there was real pain and mourning. The widows wept. And those who were clothed in white robes that Revelation talks about, they're clothed in white robes to cover the bloody ordeal that they went through on earth. The cross is that great and unifying form. The cross is that horizontal and vertical. The cross is that marriage of heaven and earth, of God and man. But it is also the great story of reconciliation. And here's where our stories intersect with Christ's stories, each one of us, no matter how much doubt we may have, because each one of us knows how to suffer. Each one of us knows what it is like to suffer. And so each one of us has at least that part of the story written. There's no question we can belong to Christ then, since he already belongs to us in his suffering and in his death. But we need to discover the second part of that story if we haven't already. We need to discover the story of God's power and the redemption that goes with the cross. After Peter raises Tabitha from the dead, her story becomes known throughout all Joppa. And then the next part of the sentence says, and many believed in the Lord. Do you see? No one came out with a proof or a white paper or a marketing campaign. They believed in the Lord because their friend had been raised from the dead, and that story spread. And all the widows who had stood next to Peter weeping and showing him the tunics and other clothing that Tabitha had made, they became part of the story too. Now, they hadn't died, but they had mourned, and their tears were real, and God wiped those tears from their eyes when, through Peter's ministry, his power was on display to raise Tabitha from the dead. And so I suppose there remain some of us for whom no amount of evidence will ever convince or ever be enough, and maybe we should simply stop trying to convince them, or maybe stop trying even to convince ourselves. Instead, let's share and let's listen. Let's listen to the stories of God at work in our lives and in other people's lives. And let's use those stories as prompts to see God at work in our life and in the whole world, in the life of the world. And let's see that instead of demanding evidence and proof, let's see if this storytelling doesn't start to kindle our faith. Let's see if faith in his love and friendship with God does not follow from these stories that we tell. And let's see if, God willing, and soon, if some of our struggles for power don't start to give way to stories of God's power in our lives. Amen.